My aunt always said that the ones who smile the widest at a funeral are the ones who already know what's in the will. I didn't understand what she meant until the morning my grandmother's lawyer called me, and I heard my mother pick up the extension in the kitchen before I'd even said hello. I'm Zoe. I'm 31 years old, and I work as a land title examiner for a registry office in Halifax, Nova Scotia. It's exactly as unglamorous as it sounds. I spend my days tracing chains of ownership, verifying legal descriptions, catching errors that could unravel property deals worth millions of dollars. Most people at dinner parties change the subject when I explain what I do. My grandmother, Nana Ruth, thought it was the most interesting job in the world. She'd call me on slow Tuesday afternoons just to ask what I was working on, genuinely curious, leaning into the phone like I was telling her a story. She passed away on a Thursday in late October, quietly in the house she'd lived in for 43 years in Lunenburg. She was 82. She'd had a good life, a full one, and she knew it. The hospice nurse told me later that she'd seemed at peace in those last hours. That made it easier and harder at the same time. I drove the 2 hours from Halifax the morning after I got the call. The road was empty, and the trees were that particular shade of November gold that feels both beautiful and like something ending. I didn't cry until I pulled into the driveway and saw her garden gloves still hanging on the hook by the back door, one slightly higher than the other, exactly the way she always left them. My mother Diane was already there when I arrived. So was my Uncle Greg, her younger brother. They were in the kitchen, and even through the front door I could hear them talking in the careful, measured tones that meant they were discussing money. It wasn't grief I heard in their voices. It was calculation. Nana Ruth had owned the Lunenburg house outright. 3 bedrooms, 2 baths, wraparound porch, deep lot, original hardwood floors, heritage designation, 2 blocks from the waterfront. In that market, the house was worth somewhere north of $700,000. My grandmother had bought it with my grandfather for $38,000 in 1981. She used to laugh about that, said she couldn't believe what a cup of coffee cost now, let alone a house. She had told me, twice, once when I was 26 and once last Christmas, that she planned to leave the house to me. Not because she loved me more than my mother or my uncle, she was careful to say that, but because, in her words, you understand what a house actually is, Zoe. Those two see property and think of what they can get for it. You look at a house and think of what it means. She wasn't wrong about that. I hadn't told anyone about those conversations, not even my closest friend. I'd learned early that with my mother, information was currency, and I'd gotten good at keeping my wallet closed. The reading of the will was scheduled for the following Monday at the office of a notary in Bridgewater, a man named Mr. Arsenault who had handled my grandmother's affairs for 20 years. In the days between her death and that appointment, my mother and uncle were relentlessly kind to me in that particular way. That meant they wanted something. My mother kept appearing at my elbow with cups of tea I hadn't asked for. My uncle clapped me on the shoulder repeatedly and said things like, "We're a team, you and me and your mom," with the enthusiasm of a man trying to close a deal. They helped sort through Nana Ruth's kitchen and took turns sighing about what a burden the house would be to maintain. Such a big place for one person. The heating costs alone in a heritage property. Did I know what a new roof ran these days? I knew exactly what a new roof ran. I also knew exactly what they were doing. Monday came. We drove together to Bridgewater in my uncle's car because my mother had suggested it, and I hadn't thought of a good enough reason to refuse. Mr. Arsenault's office was small and smelled like old paper and radiator heat, a smell I associated with good, careful work. He was a precise man in his late 60s with reading glasses he wore on a chain and a manner that suggested he had seen every variety of human behavior around death and money and had long since stopped being surprised by any of it. He read the will methodically, with the quiet authority of someone who understood that what he was saying actually mattered. The house, all its contents, and the associated parcel of land were left entirely to me. There was a pause in the room that lasted perhaps 2 seconds but felt much longer. Then my mother made a sound that was not quite a word. My uncle cleared his throat. Mr. Arsenault continued. There were smaller bequests, some furniture pieces to my mother, a specific sum to a local museum Nana Ruth had volunteered with, a few named items to long-time friends, but the house, the main asset, the thing that mattered to everyone in that room for very different reasons, was mine. On the drive back to Lunenburg, my mother sat in the front passenger seat and said almost nothing for 40 minutes. That was unusual. She is not a woman comfortable with silence. When she finally spoke, her voice had a brightness to it that didn't reach her eyes. A lot of responsibility, she said. A heritage home especially, you can't just renovate whatever you want. There are rules. I know, I said. I examine title documents for a living. She smiled. It didn't reach her eyes either. That night, lying in the small bedroom I'd slept in every summer as a child, I stared at the ceiling and listened to the house settle around me. I could hear the ocean from the window just barely, a low, constant murmur. I thought about what it would mean to actually live here, to bring my life from Halifax into these rooms, to sit on the porch in the mornings with coffee and watch the street wake up. I thought about Nana Ruth puttering around downstairs, the particular sound of her slippers on the hardwood. I also thought about what I knew about people who feel they've been passed over. In my line of work, I'd seen what grief mixed with entitlement could make people do. I'd processed title amendments that had come out of family disputes. I'd watched chains of ownership unravel because someone had filed something without authority, or a signature had been obtained under false pretense, or a transfer had gone through one office without all the relevant parties being aware. I wasn't naive, and I had not, in fact, been idle since that first phone call. 3 days after Nana Ruth died, before the will was even read, I had called a property lawyer in Halifax, a woman named Miss Akaffer who I'd worked with professionally for several years and trusted completely. I explained the situation. I told her about my grandmother's stated intentions, the family dynamics, my professional instincts. She had listened carefully. Then she asked, "Has anyone indicated they might contest?" "Not directly," I said, "but I know these people." "Then let's be proactive," she said. She had walked me through the options. Given my work, I understood most of them technically, but having her frame the legal strategy was a different thing. She saw the angles, the vulnerabilities, the timing. We agreed on a plan. The moment the estate was settled and the deed transferred into my name, we would immediately register a certificate of pending litigation as a protective notation on title, and then move to transfer the property into a properly structured trust that I would control as sole trustee. The trust structure would make any future attempt to challenge ownership or claim an interest in the property legally unwieldy in a way that would discourage anyone without a genuinely strong case. The transfer of the estate deed happened on a Wednesday. By Friday of that same week, the property was no longer legally registered under my personal name. It was held by the Zoe Whitmore Family Trust. I told no one. The weeks that followed had a strange, stretched quality. I commuted between Halifax and Lunenburg on weekends, slowly moving my life into the house with the quiet deliberateness of someone who had decided something and intended to honor that decision. I loved the house more with every visit. The way the light moved through the front windows in the late afternoon, the sound the old wooden stairs made, a particular sequence of 2 creaks, 3rd step, and 7th, that I had memorized as a child and that still felt like being greeted. My mother called regularly. She asked questions that were not quite questions. Had I thought about what I was doing with the place long term? Had I considered that I could get a very nice condo in Halifax and invest the difference? Didn't I worry about being so isolated? Wasn't the drive getting tiring? My uncle sent me links to articles about the cost of maintaining heritage properties in Nova Scotia. Once he called to tell me he'd run into a real estate agent he knew and happened to mention that the Lunenburg house might be coming available. I thanked him for thinking of me. I said nothing else. The call that changed everything came on a Tuesday evening in January. I was at the Lunenburg house, sitting at the kitchen table with a glass of wine and a pile of work I'd brought with me, when my mother's name appeared on my phone. I nearly let it go to voicemail. I should have let it go to voicemail. I've been talking to Greg, she said, skipping a greeting entirely. And we've done some research. We spoke to a lawyer. I set my wine down. Nana Ruth was not herself in her last months, my mother continued. You know that. She was on medication. She was isolated. And that's not my opinion, Zoe. That's a clinical assessment. There are grounds to challenge the will on the basis of undue influence. Greg and I have already started the process. What process? I said very quietly. It's nothing personal. We just don't think Nana Ruth would have made this decision with a clear mind. She loved us all equally. The fact that she left everything to one grandchild is not consistent with her character, and we have people who will say so. A pause. We're not trying to take anything from you. We just want what's fair. There was a specific sound she made when she said what's fair, a slight softening of the vowels, a practiced reasonableness that I had heard my whole life. It was the tone she used when she was about to do something that was not fair at all and wanted to be remembered as the reasonable one. Okay, I said. A beat. Okay. I heard you, I said. Thank you for telling me. I hung up and immediately called Ms. Okafor. She listened without interrupting while I explained what my mother had said. When I finished, she made a small sound that was almost satisfaction. They're going to claim undue influence, she said. That's the most common challenge in these situations. They'll need to establish that your grandmother's judgment was compromised and that you had unusual access to her. A pause. How well documented is your relationship with her? Very well documented, as it turned out. I had texts, emails, voicemails, birthday cards in her handwriting, photographs from visits over the years, a letter she had written me the previous spring that spoke, in her plain and affectionate way, about why she wanted me to have the house. That letter, Miss Okafor pointed out, was dated and signed and had been written while Nana Ruth was by any standard in full possession of her faculties. It was not a legal document, but it was powerful evidence of consistent, clearly expressed intent. Additionally, I had something my mother and uncle did not know about. Mr. Arsenal had mentioned to me privately, after the will reading, that my grandmother had visited him 9 months before her death to update the will and had brought her own physician's letter confirming her cognitive capacity. She had apparently anticipated a challenge. She had prepared for it. Your mother and uncle can file a notice of objection with the surrogate court, Ms. Okafor explained. That begins a formal process. It takes time and money on both sides. But here's the thing, the property isn't in your personal name anymore. It's in the trust. Any challenge to the will, even if it succeeded, would apply to the original transfer of the estate. The trust is a subsequent independent legal step. Unwinding it would require a separate proceeding, and the bar for that is considerably higher. She paused. I'm not going to tell you this is nothing. It's a process. But they picked the wrong person to try this on. I laughed, which surprised me. It wasn't a happy laugh exactly. It was the laugh of someone who had been very tired for a very long time and had finally set something heavy down. The following weeks moved like two things at once. Slow in the way that legal processes always are, and fast in the way that clarity can be, once you stop waiting for something to happen and start responding to what's already in motion. Miss Okafor filed the relevant documents registering the trust and our response to the notice of objection. She was methodical and unflappable in a way that I found deeply reassuring. She had done this before. She knew what it looked like. My mother called twice more during that period. The first time, she tried the reasonable tone again and suggested we find a family solution before things became expensive. I told her to contact my lawyer. The second time, she cried, which she knew had worked on me before. I listened until she was finished and then told her again to contact my lawyer. After that, she stopped calling. My uncle sent one final text. It said simply, "You'll regret this." I didn't respond. The morning Miss Okafor called to tell me that my mother and uncle had withdrawn the objection, I was standing in the Lunenburg house making oatmeal. It was a Saturday. The February light was coming in sideways through the kitchen window, that particular thin winter light that makes everything look slightly more real than it is. "They withdrew," she said. "Filed a notice of discontinuance this morning. It's done." I turned off the stove. Why? A few reasons. The physician's letter was significant. Once we disclosed it, the undue influence argument became a very difficult case to make, and the trust structure created a second problem for them that their lawyer would have advised them they couldn't easily solve. A pause. Also, frankly, the cost. These proceedings are not cheap, and they would have been going up against a well-documented estate with a notary who has been practicing for 20 years and kept immaculate records. Their lawyer probably told them the math didn't work. The math didn't work. My grandmother had known somehow that it would come to math eventually. She had structured everything so that the math would work for me instead. I stood in her kitchen for a while after I hung up. I looked to the window she had stood at for 43 years. The garden was buried in snow, but I knew exactly where everything was: the rose bushes along the fence, the small beds where she grew herbs every summer, the stone path she and my grandfather had laid themselves one weekend in 1987 because they couldn't afford to hire anyone and figured it couldn't be that complicated. She had been right about me. I did understand what a house was. My mother and I have not spoken since. I don't say that with satisfaction. I say it because it's true, and because part of growing up is understanding that some relationships contain a kind of cost that you cannot keep paying indefinitely. She is my mother, and I love her in the complicated way you love someone who has never fully seen you as separate from what they need. But the well had been running dry for years, and what she tried to do in the weeks after my grandmother's death had simply emptied it. I moved to Lunenburg full-time in March. I kept my job, registry work translates well to remote, and my manager was accommodating. I drive into Halifax when I need to, for court filings or client meetings, but most days I work from the kitchen table. My grandmother ate breakfast up for 4 decades, with the windows cracked and the sound of the street coming in. The 3rd step and the 7th step still creak when I come downstairs in the morning. I've decided not to fix them. Nana Ruth understood houses better than most people I've met. She understood that they're not assets or burdens or commodities. They're the places where your ordinary life becomes something you'll remember. She gave me this one because she trusted me to know that, and because she loved me enough to plan carefully so that trust couldn't be taken apart by people who saw a different kind of value in what she built. I go out on the porch most evenings when the weather allows. The harbour is visible in the gap between 2 houses across the street, just a thin wedge of dark water, but it's enough. Some nights the fog rolls in thick off the Atlantic and the street disappears, and it's just me in the house and the sound of the water somewhere out in the dark. I think about her on those nights. I think about the garden gloves on the hook by the back door, one slightly higher than the other. I left them exactly where she hung them. I keep thinking about those garden gloves on the hook by the back door, one slightly higher than the other. Such a small thing. But that's what stays with you. Not the legal filings, not the timestamps on the trust documents, not the morning Miss O'Caffell called to say it was over. What stays is the gloves and the fact that my grandmother hung them exactly that way for 43 years and never once thought to straighten them out. She was a woman who understood that some things are worth protecting and some things are worth letting go, and she knew the difference between the two. I didn't fully understand that about her until after she was gone. What my mother and uncle did wasn't a surprise, not really. I'd been watching them calculate for years, adding things up in the background the way certain people always do. What surprised me was how clearly I saw it once the will was read. The mask didn't slip gradually. It just wasn't there anymore, and once you see something that plainly, you can't unsee it. I don't think they're evil people. I think they're people who convinced themselves they deserved something and then built an entire moral framework around that conviction. That's a different thing, and in some ways it's harder to reckon with. Evil is simple. Entitlement dressed up as fairness is something you have to untangle slowly, especially when it's coming from people who raised you. What I've come to believe is that outcomes like mine don't happen by accident. My grandmother didn't just leave me a house. She left me a demonstration of what it looks like to act with genuine integrity, to do the careful, unglamorous work of protecting the people you love, even when they're not in the room, even when you won't be around to see whether it holds. She updated that will with her physician's letter in hand. She thought about what might happen after she was gone, and she made decisions accordingly. That's not luck, that's character, and it's the kind you build over a lifetime of small choices that nobody applauds you for. I think about that when I'm sitting at her kitchen table with a work file in front of me and the window cracked and the street noise coming in. The habit of doing things right, quietly, correctly, without waiting for recognition, that's what actually protects you in the end. Not the trust documents themselves, but the person you have to become in order to create them in the first place. And then there's the matter of not falling apart when the pressure arrives. My mother cried on the phone. My uncle sent that text. There were weeks where the weight of it sat in my chest like something I couldn't put down. I went through the motions of work and weekends and didn't tell most people what was happening, because I didn't have the words for it yet. But I kept making the next decision. Called the lawyer. Answered the letters. Drove to Lunenburg on weekends and kept moving things in, one box at a time, as if I'd already decided how this ended. I think. I decided how it ended before it even started. Nana Ruth knew who I was. She trusted me with something precious, not because I was the most convenient choice, but because she believed I had the judgment to handle it and the spine to defend it. I don't say that with pride so much as a kind of responsibility. She was right about me, and I had to make sure I stayed the person she was right about. The third step and the seventh step creak every morning when I come downstairs. I've decided not to fix them. Some things you keep exactly the way they were left to you.